and I, all that's broken on the riverside.
Greetings. This is We Act Radio, broadcasting from historic Anacostia, Washington, D.C., on land that was once the land of the Nacotchtank people who were displaced within about 40 years of Europeans first arriving here. And historic Anacostia is now experiencing another kind of displacement as people and businesses that were established for a long, long time are being displaced very rapidly by gentrification and luxury developments. I am delighted for anyone who is joining us either live or through rebroadcast. This is the first show in a new series focusing on many kinds of violence that are around us in our world, and also paths to building peace that are also available to us. I'm calling this new series Conversations Toward Repair, and I'm your host, Virginia Avniel Spatz. A little bit later in the program, we'll be joined by Netfa Freeman of the Black Alliance for Peace and Pan-African Community Action. But now I am delighted to be joined in our virtual studio by two guests that I am just so happy are helping to launch this new series. We will hear from Lashonia Thompson-El, who is Executive Director of Peace for DC. And in the past, I have a little bit of a bio here. Ms. Thompson-El served as co-chief of the Violence Reduction Unit in DC's Office of the Attorney General and helped to oversee the Cure the Streets program. She's one of DC's leading restorative justice practitioners and has been active in improving re-entry services, especially for women. We are also joined by Nneka Grimes, who is operations manager for Peace Academy DC, part of the Peace for DC program, and a recent graduate, in fact, of the first cohort of the DC Peace Academy. So with that, I will ask Lashonia and Nneka to each in order just say a few words if I left anything out of your bio, or if you just want to say hello to our audience so that we can get our conversation started. Lashonia, can you start?
Yes, thank you so much, Virginia, and We Act Radio for having me. This is my first time on the show, so this is like a major accomplishment for me. I was born and raised in Ward 8, and in 2011, I was released from incarceration, and I returned to Ward 8 after being away for 18 years as a result of some criminal convictions. And this is the first time I've ever heard anyone call out the name of the Native Americans who inhabited that neighborhood, that land in the past. And I just honor you for that. And now I'm sitting here thinking, like, how can I learn more about who actually was wiped out in the other parts of Ward 8? So thank you for holding that up. And I look forward to the conversation.
All right, thank you. And Nneka, some welcoming words or anything I got wrong? You have to unmute.
It's me. Hi, We Act Radio viewers, and thank you for having us, Miss Virginia. You are correct. I am the operations manager for Peace for DC, and I'm also a graduate of the first cohort of Peace Academy. I've done, just a little background, I've done a lot of community service, probably for half of my life, about 15 years. I got with DCPS and then Cure the Streets under the DC Attorney General's office. And I am now the operations manager at Peace Academy. Thank you for having me. For us.
I'm delighted to have you both. And let's start, maybe because you were sort of on the inside of it. Nneka, you could just tell us a little bit what is actually meant by the DC Peace Academy. What is the program? What was your experience?
Okay. My experience was excellent, and I'm still experiencing, as you can see. It was uh, it expanded my education on frontline work. I felt like I knew the basics to get the point across and I followed the model, but Peace Academy really dug in deep when it came to giving me therapy methods that I can use with my participants, um, self-molding skills. For a bunch of different parts of Peace Academy, over 30 courses. My favorite was with our partnership with Roca, who did cognitive behavioral theory.
Could you, I'm sorry, I'm afraid I don't really know much about, or I'm going to say anything about Roca. Can you go ahead and explain that a little bit?
Roca, they're a big partner with Peace Academy. They taught about 6 different classes. They go over CBT, which is cognitive behavioral theory, and just reforming how you think, catching your impulsivities. They broke down how the brain actually works, different parts of the brain, so we could recognize when something happens, what part of the brain we're using and which part we really need to be using. Catching our habits and reinventing them into something better.
Okay.
That's when.
Yeah. That was very clear. We run across a lot of names and a lot of acronyms, and not everybody listening will know them, even though some people are really used to them. And then, of course, there are things where the same letters pronounced one way or in one context means one thing, like BLM in many contexts means Black Lives Matter, but it's also the Bureau of Land Management. And I have to say, there were some times when I was really confused why these people were talking about what they're talking about. So, we do have to be just a little careful. And also, I want to just point out, as we're starting this conversation, that our listeners many of them will be familiar with DC and with Ward 8 in particular, which Lashonia already mentioned is one of the 2 wards that are east of the Anacostia River, and DC has experienced huge divides over certainly all my 35 years here and much, much longer. We have the Anacostia River. We also have farther to the northwest, Rock Creek Park, which divides the city in a different way. And some people know those like the back of their hand, and then some listeners from some other place in the country or the world won't know them at all. So I like to make sure we're talking on awareness of both audiences, and also awareness that the models that DC uses are developed elsewhere, and vice versa, that DC can be a model for other places that are trying to work on gun violence. And so, Lashonia, I'd like to ask you to maybe give us a little wider view of what DC for Peace is. The Peace Academy is one program, and DC for Peace is a wider organization, but also very new to the landscape. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So Peaceful DC is a private foundation that was created by Roger Marmot, Marmet. So Roger created Peaceful DC because his son was murdered in 2018, basically driving through a neighborhood in DC, and someone was shooting at a person across the street and shot his son and murdered him. And I think it's safe to say when Roger started to learn more about the gun violence, which he always refers to the inequality of gun violence, I think it just really took him for a loop. And he felt compelled to commit his life to making a difference by supporting the frontline peacemakers who have the relationships and influence and credibility to actually prevent shootings and reduce gun violence in high-risk neighborhoods. And so he started Peaceful DC and hired me as the first executive director. And one of our efforts is the DC Peace Academy. And so we started the DC Peace Academy because we wanted to train the frontline workers and make sure that they have all the tools that they need to do the great work that they've been charged to do, connecting with high-risk individuals, using their credibility to help change community norms and help move people throughout the transformation process. Understanding that this is a very complex problem, we've decided to teach things. And let me go back a bit. Like before, when we started Peaceful DC, we consulted with and had multiple meetings with the local community-based organizations who have been funded by the district government to facilitate CVI, community violence intervention. So they told us what they needed to learn, and they told us who should be teaching these classes. So it's hyper local. All of the teachers are DC-based practitioners who've been working in community violence intervention for decades, and they are experts in restorative justice and transformative justice. And they're the ones that have taken the lead on teaching the students. And what we've learned from the first cohort, that it is about teaching and learning and developing tools, but it's also about creating a safe space and a brave space for our frontline peacemakers to be able to come together and process trauma, whether it's trauma from their past, trauma from the vicarious trauma that they experience every day, or whether it's, the stuff that's happening in real time in their communities. And we wanted to try to break down the silos and build communication across neighborhoods, across community-based organizations. And so Peaceful DC, I think, did more than we thought it would do, because we was initially thinking we want them to be able to learn the tools that they need to make a difference, but they actually created a healing space for themselves and for one another. And that's what I'm most excited about and most proud of. And so, like the cognitive behavior theory that Nneka mentioned earlier, it's basically like a user-friendly way to utilize cognitive practices with high-risk individuals and helping them learn to regulate their emotions when they are in crisis, or if they have a conflict and they've experienced a lot of trauma, and you want them to slow that cycle down and make a different choice, evaluate, their values, the consequences of their actions, and do something different. Somebody actually has to facilitate that process for them. And we believe that our frontline outreach workers are like best positioned to do that. And we are not a fan of like just responding to harm. Like, we do believe in, the need for healing and holding space for people who have been impacted by harm, but we really want to prevent harm and prevent shootings and prevent homicides before they happen. And I just want to say, you mentioned east of the river. I know 2 moms who have lost 3 sons in the same neighborhood. One, I grew up with her, and I think she wouldn't mind me saying her name, Saditra Brown, lost 3 sons in the same neighborhood east of the river. And another woman who I don't know personally, so I won't say her name. She lives in Washington, grew up in Washington Highlands, raised her family in Washington Highlands, lost 3 sons to gun violence in the same neighborhood. And, all of this has been in the 10 years since I've been released. So I just wanted to hold space for that.
Yes, thank you. And I do want to take just a moment to, as you said, to acknowledge that there is so much trauma for the people when you're and I do want to, maybe we'll elaborate a little bit on what frontline worker means in this context, but simply living or working east of the river means that you are exposed to some level of trauma absolutely every day, every time you get on the bus, every time you stand on the street. My own experience is more limited than people who grew up there, but I've sat in bus stops where somebody had been previously murdered and the blood was still on the ground. Some of us are experiencing this all the time. And then there are people other places in our city, and unfortunately people who are making decisions often haven't got any of that experience. And we are constantly asking the most traumatized people to be like the calmest, even if somebody's pointing a gun at them or whatever might be going on. I did want to just ask you to bring that up a tiny bit or a little bit more, just to explain a little bit more what it means to be on the front lines of trying to prevent conflict.
Yes, I'll try to be quick. It's kind of complicated because in DC, we like to complicate things. But we have several district government agencies that are funding community violence intervention, which is the public health approach to gun violence intervention. We have the ONE's office, the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, and they have some community-based organizations that are working under their model, and they're funded to staff up the communities that are high risk. And they do that by hiring credible individuals who have relationships. Sometimes they're called violence interrupters. We have the DYRS, which hires credible messengers to work with young people who are committed to the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services. And that basically means they're committed to the system, but they're living in community, and they have a credible messenger assigned to them to help them through the transformation process and, to stay on the right track. And then you have programs that are funded through the DC Office of the Attorney General, Cure the Streets. They have 10 programs in 10 different neighborhoods where they're employing the Cure Violence Global model, which was started by a medical doctor, Dr. Gary Sluckin. And he believes that we should treat violence in the same way that we should treat a disease, hiring those who live in and have ties to high-risk neighborhoods and allowing them to help to detect and mediate conflicts, change community norms, and treat trauma. And then you have safe passage workers who are working under the Deputy Mayor of Education. And you also have hospital violence intervention programs at MedStar, Howard University, and Georgetown, I believe it is. I could be wrong about that third hospital. But basically, those frontline workers, what they do is they're in the community daily, and they are building trust, engaging community. They keep their ear to the streets, and hopefully people will contact them when they know about conflicts or they know about challenges that people have in the community that could potentially lead to violence. And so their job is to detect and mediate conflicts, as I said earlier. And they are tracking the work that they do. The Cure Violence Global, they use the ComCare database system, and they are practicing relentless engagement and really helping to move high-risk individuals through the transformation process and change their thinking, change their behavior, and again, changing norms, because some of this is cultural. I mentioned earlier, I went to prison when I was 19 years old. For me, violence had become the norm. I wasn't born that way. I used to be afraid of violence. I used to run from fights. I was afraid to fight, and I got chastised for it repeatedly. My parents, my older siblings, my peers. And so eventually I succumbed to that violence and got trapped in that cycle, and I caused serious harm. And so a lot of it from my perspective is cultural. And so again, it's a really, really big charge. And I appreciate you for acknowledging, like, we're asking people who have been exposed to this trauma, complex chronic trauma, who have transformed their lives, to go back in the communities where they grew up, the neighborhoods that they love, and now help other people do the same. And I think it's unjust if we don't provide them with the proper support and resources and coaching that they need. One of the other things about the DC Peace Academy, we have a social worker and we have life coaches, and the students who are frontline peacemakers have access to these social workers and these life coaches so that they can develop themselves professionally and personally. And our most important goal is to make sure that they can be the best that they can be, because we consider them our heroes. They're the ones out there risking their lives every day to try to prevent shootings.
Thank you. I appreciate all of that. And I know that Nneka has worked as a credible messenger and could maybe speak to that a little bit more. So I'm going to bring her back into the stream. And while I do that, I do want to mention another question that your remarks just brought up. And for those who might just be joining us, we are speaking with Lashonia Thompson-El of Peace for DC and Nneka Grimes of the DC Peace Academy, which is a program within Peace for DC. This is We Act Radio. And I'll let Nneka go ahead and say anything you'd like to add about the experience of being a credible messenger and the kind of support that is useful there. And then I'll ask my other question.
Yes. I have had experience in being a credible messenger, but I have more experience in being an outreach worker for Cure the Streets, which I'm also still currently an outreach worker. And being an outreach worker, you deal with participants every day. Your job is to form a risk reduction plan. Well, I'll explain what that is. A risk reduction plan is you set a number system of how high risk they are, and you try to bring that number down to an average with goal setting, as well as using the things that we learned in Peace Academy. As I said, those therapeutic methods, teaching them how to deal with their anger management, or just things that they'll see run into on a daily basis that could involve violence. These guys and ladies are set in these what we call target areas, where we call them, the target areas are places in which we have designated high risk in violence, in gun violence and domestic violence. And they are succumb to this stuff every day. So we just try to guide them and keep them focused and help them advance as much as we can. So it's just basically like a day-to-day life coach, really.
Thanks, Nneka. I want to also, if possible, bring into our conversation Nikita Gilbert, who is the Director for Learning at the DC Peace Academy. And I think we lost her. So we'll perhaps have that conversation at another time. And I will bring up the question that has been in the back of my mind. I think that our Director for Learning is going to be back with us in just a moment. But I'm going to go ahead and ask one question that has come up for me as both of you were speaking, and that is the relationship of either the frontline violence interrupters or the Peace for DC as an organization, relationship with the courts and with police and with incarceration, because I'll just leave it there. I could go on, but how about I just let you speak to that in any way that you would like to answer. And I'm going to ask Lashonia to go ahead and speak on that.
Thank you for that question, Virginia. And just a part of CBT is labeling your feelings, right? So I'll just acknowledge that that's always a difficult question to answer, because we always want to make sure that we're not sort of like adding fuel to the fire. Like, we have a challenging relationship with government, we being African American people in this country. And so I would never want to make matters worse by saying the wrong thing. But what I will say is that by using a public health approach to community violence intervention, we rely on transformative restorative systems. And so we don't rely on harmful systems that tend to lean towards using punishment as a way to change behavior, because we don't believe that punishment actually is successful at changing behavior. And we believe that actually incarceration causes more trauma, and it adds to the cyclical, like generational violence that we're seeing. And so, for example, like we had the city under siege and we had mass incarceration in the 90s. And a lot of what we're seeing now, from my perspective, is the aftermath of that. And so, take me from example, I'm almost 50 and I have adult children and I have grandchildren, and my grandchildren are growing up in the same neighborhood where I grew up at. And I am the matriarch of my family at 50 years old, and we have layers of trauma that we are coping with: poverty, trauma, lack of education with the DC public school system, the food deserts, the lack of health care. It could go on and on. And not much has changed for certain demographics of individuals. And so we believe that we should treat the root causes of violence, and we should create healthy systems, because the existing systems are not addressing the needs or the times that we're in right now. And so we think that, like, we need to be innovative, and we need to use evidence-based approaches that actually have been proven to work, scientific approaches that have been proven to work. And so this is one of them: Cure Violence Global, CBT, restorative justice, and things of that nature. And if there's anything more specific you want to ask me about that, that could be helpful, I'm open.
Well, I do want to give you an opportunity to speak to critics of Cure the Violence or any one of the violence interrupter programs. A lot of people will say that the data just isn't there, and then other people blame the inconsistent nature of funding. There's all kinds of issues there, and just what would you say to people who say, well, I don't see the evidence?
I would say, where is the evidence that policing or incarceration works? And nobody is talking about doing away with police or prisons. And I would also say we should evaluate these programs. Cure the Streets has been operating since 2018. The One's Office has been operating since 2018. Almost 5 years. We should hold our city accountable, and we should encourage them and demand that they evaluate these programs, and people have a right to know if they are working.
That is something our city is not, or I don't think we're alone in it, not very good at. We are in, I think we're in what, year 17 now of the 5-year experiment of mayoral control of our city schools. It was supposed to be evaluated and then changed, and instead we just keep coasting. So thank you for those. Were very powerful remarks that I will use if someone raises this issue again, because I do see it coming up, and there is a lot of fight. People have their favorite programs that they want to see funded, and then we work on this scarcity idea, and people are fighting for a little bit of power and a little bit of funds, and it becomes a bad cycle. And when we're talking about funding, and when we're talking about the deep nature of this, I don't even know if we can call it a problem. This aspect of our society, gun violence, is incredibly costly. As Peace for DC funded a study that came out last year that showed that just in DC, in one single year, we lost $1 billion to various forms of trying to deal with gun violence. And individual shootings cost us $1 million when you count in the people who are investigating, the medical costs, and none of that is even factoring in the costs, the human costs, and the way that our society is just constantly barraged by this this scourge, I guess. I'm coming up with all these funny words. I don't know what else to call it. So we don't have much time left, but if you would like to maybe address that that study or give us anything else you'd like to say about the cost. And I'll let Lashonia speak, and then Nneka, and then I think we will have to start wrapping up soon.
I think you summed it up well, Virginia. So I'll just say the human cost is devastating. We have 3 students that started. We just started school on Tuesday, and we have our second cohort of 25 students, and 3 of them have lost 2 siblings to gun violence. And we sat in circle yesterday, and I'm going to be honest, we talked about it like it was so normal, because I lost 1 sibling. I'm sure other people have lost at least 1 sibling or parent, and many, many friends. And I was just taken aback by the fact that we got up out of circle and went about our day like as if we didn't just hear what we heard. And so the human cost is devastating our people, and I'm really worried. And as I said yesterday in circle, you know, what I bring to the table is passion, love for my people, and passion for healing. And I'll just leave it at that, because the cost of gun violence, I don't even think we know yet, like, how much it's costing us.
And Nneka, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I agree with you, Lashonia. As far as the financial deficit that when it pertains to gun violence, it's ridiculous, especially when being a frontline worker, you see all this money going into the investigation and the search for the gentleman. But what about the mom? That lost her child? What about the child that lost their father or mother or grandma to gun violence? Are we educating them on how to come back from that? Are we putting money into that? Because literally the money that they're putting into is the frontline workers, partially, and then sending us to fix them when I feel like they might need family funding in general and be educated as far as how to deal with it. And Peace Academy, which I love, teaches us how to teach other people how to deal with the trauma. But I can go on, but I do agree with my director on that.
Well, thank you. And we could go on, but we have come to the bottom of the hour. And for those who might be just joining, or a reminder, we Act Radio, broadcasting from historic Anacostia, what was once Nacotchtank land. And up in just a minute will be Netfa Freeman, who is with the Pan-African Community Action and Black Alliance for Peace, who will be talking about a different aspect of how violence enters our world and how we might seek to address it. And I am just so grateful to Lashonia Thompson-El, who is the executive director of Peace for DC, and Nneka Grimes, who is the, let me get this right, operations manager for the DC Peace Academy. And we will have to have Nikita Gilbert, the director for learning, a different day. And certainly we can continue this conversation again later. Thank you both so much for being with us. And I am going to now say goodbye to our first segment and bring in Netfa Freeman. So let me, and Netfa is already waving. So our next guest is Netfa Freeman, who is with the Pan-African Community Action Group, which was started locally but works internationally or has an international focus, and Black Alliance for Peace. And he is here in large part to tell us about the International Month of Action Against AFRICOM, which begins with the beginning of October. But first, I don't have a long bio for Netfa, so I will invite him to introduce himself.
Thank you, Virginia. You don't need a long bios are just I don't know, they're, but I wanted to, so that's good. I'm on the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace. On the Africa team of the co-coordinate the Africa team of Black Alliance for Peace. PACA, Pan-African Community Action, doesn't have a international. We have an international lens or focus or purview rather, but our emphasis in our work is local. And so, that they're the Pan-African Community Action. So the localized, working for locally based, community-based power with the Pan-African perspective, revolutionary Pan-African perspective. And the work that we do that's international is because we're a member of the Black Alliance for Peace. So the Black Alliance for Peace has individual members as well as organizational members, and we're organizational member, and we think this is all interconnected, and we can get into the discussion of how, because I think AFRICOM is a perfect segue. The U.S. Africa Command, this military command center in Africa, is a perfect example of the related nature of the U.S. Of the U.S. to Black people, locally, domestically, and then internationally.
Okay, great. Thanks for that clarification. And I was going to ask you to start with just explaining to those who don't know what AFRICOM is, because I will confess that when I first heard the expression, I thought it was something that people had invented to I thought the com meant commerce, and that it was about, the big capitalist, I don't know, endeavor, which isn't all that wrong, but was I didn't realize until more recently that it means, as you said, African Command, and that it actually is something from, it's a U.S. command center that has been funded since, I think, 2007. And you can explain it much better than I can, but I do think that some of our listeners might not even know what AFRICOM is or why it matters.
Right, and that's why we're doing the International Month of International Month of Action against AFRICOM, because we know a lot of people don't know about it, and so that's part of it, is to raise awareness about it. So to go back, and I like the way you said it's not all that wrong for it to be related to commerce, because what the military does for the United States, and we get all kind of propaganda that the United States military is defending the United States, and then they'll throw vague stuff in there. It's defending U.S. interest, right? And then sometime they'll even really go hard on the propaganda reminiscent of the Red Scare when they were anti-communism. They'll say it's fighting terrorism. That's the new enemy to terrorism, or it started to be the new enemy after 9/11, and they started chasing things that weren't even responsible for 9/11. But what people need to know, and this is what we call, it's the military aspect of imperialism, is that the United States operates 8 different military command centers around the world in all of the major continents. And so that means they're all over. They have over 800 military bases scattered around the globe. And that, there's no such thing happens in the U.S., just to be clear, and people probably know that they don't have that. But this is really how the United States exercises dominance around the world when it comes to, like you talked about earlier, the commerce, and basically looking at the origins of really European colonial, Western European exploitation of the world, the globe, particularly Africa, colonization, which is turned now into a one-sided commerce where the raw minerals, and we're just using Africa as an example because we're going to get into Africa Command, but this is really, the non-white world is subject to this, where the raw minerals of these countries and the markets and the labor of these countries are extracted and exploited in those countries, all for the profit making of multinational corporations, particularly U.S.-based multinational corporations. And this is imperialism. So they'll take, for example, diamonds, in the Southern African region, gold in Ghana, they export and they extract chocolate, coca, really, the raw base for coca. But then the manufacturers in the factory, the refining into a finished product doesn't take place in Africa and Ghana. It takes place outside. And that the super profits that are made from the necessary raw material for chocolate bars or anything chocolate, it doesn't come to the people whose land is being exploited. And then not only there's land being exploited, the people are being exploited because they have to harvest it. Right. The same thing with rubber, like if you take for Liberia, for example. So what's happened, bringing it up to date, is that over time, people have always resisted such exploitation. We had the independence movements in Africa where they overthrew the yoke of imperialism with, the colonizers, Britain and France and Italy and whoever, and that now the U.S. has become the new colonizer. So we're operating under what's called neocolonialism, a new form of colonialism where it's all the outward trappings of independence that they have, all the characteristics of independence, but really their politics and their economy is controlled by the outside. And the United States leads this scenario. It leads it as an extension of Europe. We have to remember the United States is a settler colony. So anyway, so as to enforce this, because wherever there's oppression and unfair treatment, there's going to be resistance. But to make sure that no progressive or revolutionary governments emerge in Africa, or that no movement emerges that's going to assert the self-determination of the people, they put their militaries on the ground. They plunge Africa into turmoil, foster and instigate unrest, created the terrorism right now on the ground that they claim to be fighting, created it, right? And then we'll go and tell you and me that the military is there to fight Al-Shabaab or to fight Boko Haram. No historical context is given to where these groups emerged from or any of the conditions or why. I mean, if we were to ask ourselves why Africa, is the way it is, some of it is just propaganda or media. It's spun a different way, but it is in turmoil. There is a lot of violence and poverty and despair. If we don't ask ourselves why, then the only conclusion that we can come with is that African people are inferior. And if you see people of African descent everywhere, even outside of Africa, the same conditions seem to apply. Look at us in the United States. Our communities are wrought with violence, and they're going to send in the police, militarized police, right? And so but we have to ask ourselves and realize that our history, this is not, if you look at our history, this is not the case. African people are not inferior. Our communities and our civilizations did not start off this way. And it's a direct result of not of past colonization, but continued foreign policy. And if we look at the domestic policy of why our communities are like that, it mirrors, it's the same thing. So
I do want to interrupt for just a second, because I'm afraid that some listeners might think, well, this is an exaggeration or something. And so I just want to share words that actually come from AFRICOM. AFRICOM has been, regularly testifying to the House and Senate about its achievements, as they would express it. And one of their explanations for what they're doing is Africa is a source of vast deposits of strategic minerals that America and the world needs for our technology in the 21st century. And then they go on to explain that the mere billions that we spend on AFRICOM is a good investment for US taxpayers. And they have no problem. These are the words of the general in charge and the administrators in charge of this testifying to our government. So I just in case anybody was thinking this was a little bit of a stretch, I just want to stick some words in there from AFRICOM directly. And I want to remind listeners that you're listening to We Act Radio, and our guest in this segment is Netfa Freeman from the Pan-African Community Action Group and Black Alliance for Peace. And he's here in large part to tell us about the month of action that is coming up in just a couple of days. And in fact, I think there's a training tomorrow, a webinar coming up sometime this week, or is that not till next week?
It's Saturday.
Saturday.
This coming Saturday, October 1st, marks the anniversary of the official launch of AFRICOM. That's the U.S. Africa Command. The U.S. Africa Command is basically the structure that coordinates all of the military operations and activity of the United States on the African continent. Its headquartered is in Germany, because the African people didn't want it back when they launched it in 2007, and they were looking for a place to have it headquartered on the continent of Africa, and all of the masses of the people roundly rejected it, and therefore the leaders had to reject it. It was under George Bush. And so then after Barack Obama came into office, for some people got, they just had illusions thinking that because the blackface was the president of imperialism, that meant something different. And so, but it did mean something different. So then it took ground, it took root in Africa. The headquarters is still in Stuttgart, Germany, but now you have AFRICOM spreading across the continent and all in 53 of the 54 African states, with the only exception of Eritrea having some form of U.S. military presence, whether it be a lily pad base or military to military cooperation, strategic plans, or anything. Now, the International Month of Africa against AFRICOM, that Black Alliance for Peace has been doing, this is our third year doing it. We've had a campaign when we first started in 2017. There was a little bit before that we started on it. It still exists, U.S. Out of Africa Shut Down AFRICOM. So the International Month of Action is because of what you opened up with, is that a lot of people just don't know about AFRICOM. They don't know that tax dollars are going to it. They don't know what it means. And so what we've done, we have on, and people could go to the website. I don't know if it's something that you can bring up. It's the website that people should go to is blackallianceforpeace.com/AFRICOM, AFRICOM 2022. And on that page, we have all the tools that are needed for the International Month of Action against AFRICOM. The first week, which kicks off with a webinar on October 1st. We have a webinar that's entitled Colonialism, Compradors, and the Militarized Capitalist Crisis in Africa. It starts 1 p.m. Eastern Time. California is 10 a.m. and in West Africa it's 6 p.m. The speakers will be some from on the ground in the continent of Africa, some from here. In fact, everybody's African, everybody's Black, but the exception of, I think, Abayemi Ezekwe, who really is, I don't know how he identifies, his name is, but he's the editor of the Pan-African Newswire, and so he lives in the U.S. But he's one of the speakers. So we kick off the month of Action against AFRICOM on October 1st with this webinar. You can find access to it on the AFRICOM page that I mentioned. And then the second week, we're asking people to organize facilitate teach-ins wherever you are. There's tools on the page that will help you, modules for teach-ins that will help you go through it, and you don't even have to know anything about AFRICOM. You just do an interactive teach-in, popular education type teach-in where everybody's a teacher, everybody's a student. And then week 3, we're asking people to organize mass actions, such as banner drops. A banner drop is, where you would go somewhere very visible and drop a big banner that says something very striking about and exposing the nature of AFRICOM. And you want to be core. That's just one action you can do. You could do a demonstration or whatever, protest or something somewhere. But we're asking people to week 3 by doing a bunch of actions against AFRICOM. Hopefully people will record them. And document them on social media and use the hashtags US Out of Africa, Shut Down AFRICOM. And then last week, we're going to ask people, we have a bunch of media graphics on the page also. We're asking people to share the AFRICOM educational resources on social media. There's a number of educational resources. Share them on social media, share them in your community. We have a brochure that you can print out. It's a 3 trifold brochure that people can print out, and it's about AFRICOM. It's educating people about what AFRICOM is. And so, there's the brochure. And so, we did everything we could. There's a number of there's a number of things there. And at the bottom, we're also asking mostly organizations, emphasis on organizations, but individuals too, to endorse the month of action against AFRICOM. You can see there's already a list of people who started endorsing. We might have to update it up. And you hit that green button that says endorse here, and you can, enter in the information and it'll be asking you also like how you gonna help, whether you want to put your list name there, or whether you can do whatever. And so that's it. That those paragraphs to the left describe AFRICOM and what the campaign is, the International Month of Action, and that's what we're doing. So, yeah.
All right, I'm going to take the screen share down for a moment, and I will put back up for those who can see it the website so you can go there yourself. It's Black Alliance for Peace, the words all in a row.com /Africa or / AFRICOM 2022. And I'll also put that on We Act Radio's blog and Facebook, and make sure that people have access to that. And you mentioned in the explanation of the month that you hope that people will have teach-ins using the material that is there. Are there actions already planned that people can, that you know about, that people can join up with?
Yes. So there's one, I mean, I can tell you one that's in DC, and that one of the demands, and people should check out the demands there too, is for the Congressional Black Caucus to, one, oppose AFRICOM, and then take an unequivocal position against AFRICOM, but then also hold hearings. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. To hold hearings on the Hill that will do an investigate, to have hearing. Let me see exactly how it's worded. The Congressional Black Caucus to oppose AFRICOM and conduct hearings on AFRICOM's impact on the African continent with the full participation of members of the U.S. and African civil society. So U.S. and African civil society, meaning we don't expect them to go behind some closed door and have something that we are not, and then we're not just in attendance, but that we are helping craft the nature of this hearing and this investigation. And civil society means just regular people, non-governmental, and whatnot, regular citizens and people without any corporate interest or anything like that. And so people got to know that, one of the hot spots in Africa is Somalia. There's a U.S.-led drone war. They're using drones against them. They're claiming that they're fighting Al-Shabaab, that they won't tell that Al-Shabaab is an emergence. It's a group that emerges out of the U.S. First invasion of Somalia in 1990s, and then the overthrow of the I always mess up the name of this group. But anyway, they had been governing Somalia and brought some level of stability to it after the war, after that invasion. And then the U.S. overthrew that government with the help of Ethiopia at the time, not the Ethiopian government that's in now, but actually, well, I don't want to go off in a rabbit hole, but actually the government that was led by the groups of TPLF, which are terrorists right now, causing havoc in Ethiopia. Yes. And that group had been empowering Ethiopia. And that was the group that was the leadership in Ethiopia that helped them overthrow the government in Somalia, invaded Somalia, and they helped them destabilize Eritrea, and they're doing all kind of Eritrea, the only country without AFRICOM there. And so this is the kind of stuff in Nigeria. They, people might have, in fact, the Congress seemed to be aware. They didn't even know that the U.S. had troops or even presence in Africa until this incident in Niger. I meant to say that some person got killed. And they were like, what are we doing there? And then it came out. Well, this is part of Africa. This is part of this military command, this thing against terrorism and whatnot. So they have, and then has since come out that they were funding the construction of one of the most expensive military bases in Niger. I think it's been put on hold now, though, because of the attention around it. Hundreds of millions of U.S. tax dollars going into AFRICOM and to policing our people who are Black. That's our homeland, and they're treating our homeland just the way they treat us. Our communities here, they militarize the police here. People might know, and this is why we say that the AFRICOM is the counterpart to the 1033 program. That's the program that authorizes the U.S. defense, the military. It authorizes local police departments or for the Department of Defense to transfer military equipment to local police departments, even weapons, tanks, things like that. People may have seen this stuff being used when we were protesting in the streets around Black Lives Matter, around the killing of Michael Brown. Then you see when the protests came, you saw military stuff going out. The police had military, tanks and armored vehicles and, AK-40, all this stuff. They're looking like they're fighting, in a combat zone. So one of the things, and then I'll just say this, I know I'm going on, but we have to politically educate ourselves about African history, about particularly our independence movements. We can't be duped into thinking that the same country that has the same government in the U.S. that was responsible for, through the CIA, the overthrow of the first democratic elected government in the Congo, Patrice Lumumba. People may have heard of Patrice Lumumba. The assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the United States and the CIA have their hands bloody with that assassination. They were complicit in it. Overthrew the first the first independent country, and democratically elected also, of Kwame Nkrumah, and were overthrew it and had a coup, and Kwame Nkrumah had to flee the country. The CIA helped on it, and also selling small arms through a U.S. State Department policy to Africa after overthrowing and destabilizing all the countries, all the governments, and then having all these little wars go on. And you might have seen in Liberia and all this kind of, where they were chopping off people's hands and fostering such turmoil that those of us who are of African descent look at it and we don't understand what is going on. So we're just ashamed of Africa. We just think, oh my God, that's our people. And then things seem to correspond or legitimize it, validate it, because in our communities here, we had the same thing. So we think we're just inferior and we don't know the policies. Libya, the most progressive country in the continent of Africa at the time of 2011, was helping other African countries. People know Muammar Gaddafi, and they just, the dictator Muammar Gaddafi. I don't really like to talk about individuals because they use it to obscure things. It was the country that was helping bring unity to the continent of Africa, was helping the telecommunications grid, was starting to establish an African-wide currency, things that would put the continent on the road to independence. It overthrew the U.S., NATO, axis of domination, overthrew the Libyan government in 2011, and today Libya is in turmoil. And it's because of that, and because of the arms that Libya had, because it had its defense, that was broken into and was a part of what proliferated arms all across the Sahel region and across the Africa. And the turmoil that we see is because of the destabilization of Libya. It caused it all across Africa. The United States won't acknowledge its role, pretends to be this presider of something, stability in Africa, and they've condemned Africa to what was referred to as the forever wars.
Well, we're unfortunately coming close to the hour, and we're going to run out of time. But in the last 2 minutes, I was hoping maybe you could address a little bit the Black Alliance for Peace membership, or how people who are not of African descent can be involved. Can you say a few words about that in our last minute and a half?
Okay, real quick. So we have on the homepage, blackallianceforpeace.com, there's at the bottom of it, there's let me scroll, make sure I know what I'm talking about. Somewhere, well, in the menu, there's a join, take action, I think, is where you would join. There's pages for prompting you to join, either as an individual or an organization if you're Black, and then you put in your dues and you'll be contacted. But we also have a solidarity network. Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network is for non-Black people and organizations to join, and that's coordinated by Julie Verghese. And we just so these are ways that people can join. That's the quickest thing I can tell you. And I'm not exactly.
Okay. I will make sure that people have the website and that they can follow up. And I have to say at this point that we have to cut the conversation off for now.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Netfa Freeman of the Pan-African Community Action Group and Black Alliance for Peace. In just a couple of days, the International Month of Action Against AFRICOM starts. You can find more information at weactradio.com, and we'll be following up as the month progresses to share some of the actions that take place. And you didn't hear my introduction at the beginning. You are the second segment on a brand new show called Conversations Toward Repair that I'm just launching on We Act Radio, and I'm so glad to have you with us. And with that, we're going to have to end the broadcast. So I will say peace to Netfa and to all who've been listening.
Thank you, Virginia.